Okay, no beating around the bush today. This is why Alireza Firouzja is going to be the next world champion in my opinion. So when you look at this game from round 3 of Norway chess, he was world number 22 at the time, playing against the world number 2, Fabiano Caruana. There was a 100-point rating difference. Now the classical game was drawn, so they went to this Armageddon. But what Alireza does in this game is just insane. To blow away the world number 2 like this, you just have to see this one. So he goes with this knight f3, we have d5, d4, knight f6 from Fabi, pawn e3, so he's dabbling with these offbeat queen's pawn systems, pawn c5, he takes here, but then he's getting really good results with these. So e6 was played by Fabi, and now here's Alireza's big idea, pawn b4. So it's like a reverse note boom, the note boom variation you see in the Slav. Black plays it, aggressive opening, but here you're a tempo up. And Alireza actually smashed Sergei Karyakin with this. I'll link that at the end of the video a few months later in 2021. This was October 2020. So okay, b4 played. So black goes pawn a5. This is the acid test. You start undermining the pawn chain. So white defends. We had an exchange here on b4, b6 undermines further, and you can't be taking here. Then the bishop takes this one with check. So instead you go bishop to b5 check, black blocks that one, Alireza exchanges, and now I don't like how Fabi recaptures. He goes with the queen, Sergei went with the knight here, and this seems a lot more natural to me because then the queen can go straight to c7. But what Fabi does is go with the queen here, and now he has to spend a tempo taking it there to develop the knight later in the game. So a4 from Alireza, and this is the big point, that after black captures here, you go pawn b5. So white's got these outside connected passed pawns, but black has great control of the centre as we can see. So I really like these positions, they're very exciting, dynamic, double-edged. So bishop d6 played, sometimes this bishop spins round, blockades on these squares. We had bishop to b2, castles from black, knight b to d2, and now Fabi makes a committal decision. It's not necessarily bad, but he goes pawn to c4. I would have preferred to play maybe with queen c7 first, knight b to d7, a tiny bit more slowly, see what white does. But okay, pawn c4 gives him more of a grip on the light squares, and now he wants to bring in a knight like this, which we'll see. So queen to c2, the queen makes room for the knight by going to c7, castles from white, knight to d7, and now the bishop nudges up to c3, it just clears the b file here, makes way for the rook, improves that piece. Knight to c5 now played, pawn a5 from Alireza, and this is very principled, so he wants to start pushing those passed pawns, otherwise you're in danger of getting blown away in the centre. And now the move I'd prefer for Fabi here is actually planting the knight on d3 immediately. He brings this knight into e4, but the problem with this is that Alireza can now take here, the knight recaptures, you wouldn't want to go with the pawn and shatter your pawns, but now it can't hit this d3 square. White's doing quite well. You can go rook f to b1, bishop to d4, different ways to play, but black's lost a bit of time in the centre, the pawns are coming fast. But Alireza missed to actually take that one. Instead he went pawn b6, the queen moved away, and then he went bishop to d4. But now Fabi can take here, the knight recaptured, and he can sink this one on d3. So that piece looks a monster, but white's going to try and play around it, use those dark squares, so still very double-edged. Now the rook came to the b file here, rook a6 from Fabi, and it's worth mentioning that he could have played e5 there. He can play e5 at many moments here, but he's just trying to improve some pieces first. It's always a double-edged decision because you leave the d5 pawn weak, possibly even e5 could be weak in the future if the knight hit f3 started targeting it. So okay, he goes rook a6, Firouzja goes rook b5, the rook came to c8, this one came to the b file, pawn h6, Alireza goes g3, gives his king some room, Fabi drops this bishop back to e7, and he's playing a bit tentatively here. He could have already gone e5, and now Alireza decides to strike. He goes pawn e4. So he'd love to break up these pawns if he could, but Fabi now hits back with pawn to e5, and you can't take that one. The knight still holds it, so you have to retreat the bishop, and Alireza goes wrong here. If he wants to keep the bishop on this diagonal, then he should come all the way back to a1. There's also a tactical line with coming to e3 here, but what you can't do is go bishop to c3, because now Fabi can kick on with pawn d4. You have to retreat back to a1, and then knight b4 is the follow-up. So you're releasing these pawns to push down the board. Yes, you can actually take this one as white. You can get a position like this, but then you lose the a5 pawn. You're hitting this bishop here. I won't go too much further on the line, but it's good for black basically. You're going to come out and exchange ahead. But Fabi didn't see this. For some reason, he didn't play pawn d4. He was possibly scared of loosening the c4 pawn. If that one was then taken, his knight on d3 would be weak. He just couldn't see his way through the tactics. So he played bishop c5 instead, but Alireza doesn't need asking twice. He pounced in this position. Can you guess what he played? And if you're enjoying this game, do hit that like button and let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already to never miss a future video. So here Alireza plays the awesome exchange sack, takes on c5. Best move, because after that one's recaptured, then you shatter the pawns. This is the big point. The queen recaptures, and although the material's level but white's an exchange down, you've actually got massive compensation in these passed pawns, tying up the rook here, and now queen f5 is an excellent follow-up from Alireza. You hit this undefended rook, it went to d8 to save itself, and now rook b5 was a beautiful follow-up move, because you want to push this b pawn, and now the knight is pinned and can't capture it. That's the big threat. Plus this e pawn is still attacked. So Fabi goes f6 to defend that one, but now Alireza gets pawn b7. This is getting really scary for black. So queen d6 played, covers the queening square, but now two good follow-up moves are available for white. You could go bishop b4, pinning this knight here, or you could play, which Alireza does, the more swashbuckling move, queen to c8. Using the back rank tactics, using the pawn. White's threatening all sorts of stuff with pawn to b8. If you take this one, of course, we take back and make a queen. So Fabi's forced to actually give up knight for pawn. And after the queen recaptures, this is just a monster position for Alireza, because these two minor pieces are superior to the rook. They're also blockading this pawn and tying down the heavy pieces to the defense of the a pawn. So queen c6 from Fabi. He gets that dangerous queen off the board, but it's a very miserable endgame to try and defend now, but all Fabi needs is a draw. Alireza has to win to actually get the points. This is an Armageddon game. So the rook captured on c6, and now rook b6 from Alireza. He doesn't mind the trade. He trusts he can get that pawn down the board with things like knight c4 coming. So Fabi ducks away. Now the pawn came to a6, and rook a8 played. So will black be able to round up that pawn? Well, knight e4 comes just in time. The second rook attacks it, and now knight c5 holds the pawn. So the rook came back to c8. Alireza defends the knight with the rook, and you can already give up rook for knight here. Rook recaptures, take the pawn here, but it's just winning for white. There just isn't enough there in terms of compensation for black. So Fabi struggles on. He goes pawn h5. He doesn't have tons of moves now. Pawn h4 from Alireza. The king came to h7. And both players just bring their kings to the middle of the board now. This is very much an endgame. That's a big piece to improve. The rook came to c6. The bishop came to b4. It defends the knight here, and also there's maybe a plan now to go king d2, c3, round up that pawn, march the king in. Very difficult for black to make progress on the other side of the board. There's only actually a king there. So pawn c3 played. Fabi just chucks that one. The bishop recaptured. The king shuffled back to g6. Bishop back to b4, and now Fabi was fed up of getting suffocated, getting squeezed. He took on a6 here. So he's giving back the exchange like this. The rook recaptures, but Alireza is simply a bishop up now for the sake of a pawn, and his technique here was exceptional. So the bishop to f8 is a threat here, so rook a8 played. The king came to e4. rook d8, and now this bishop hits c5, holds the base of the pawn chain here, and everything is rock solid. So the king comes in, the rook comes up, rook a7, happy to swap, that's a one endgame, rook b5, king c6, rook b2, and white can now just improve the king. Black can't actually break through to the pawn chain. Rook c7 played, rook back to a8, and Alireza slowly and surely just actually marches his king in now because the rook is holding the bishop. So he comes all the way round. We had rook a6 check, king e7, king f5 now, and Alireza comes into f7, attacking this pawn, so Fabi gets it going with g5. And now Alireza doesn't want to take here. This is still winning, but after takes back, you've given black this opportunity to now create the outside passer. Why have those complications? So instead Alireza leaves that one. He goes bishop to e3. Yes, Fabi can take, which he does. Pawn recaptures, and after king g4, you're not actually losing that pawn because the rook can check from c4 here. So king f3 played, the king came to g6, so white's going to eat this one. Black's only hope is these central pawns, but Alireza's got it under control. He takes here, pawn f5, king g5 played, covers that f4 move. The rook came to a5 here, and now the bishop blockaded on f4. It gives the f2 pawn, but after check, king moves away, rook c3, king e2, h5 actually gets that one going, and you can't even advance this pawn because the rook is blocking it. So rook a1 played, h6, rook h1, but now king takes on f5, opening up the bishop to defend the pawn. King f2 played, takes here, and here Fabi resigned. The game is completely gone. What a crush by Alireza. If you want to see him doing the same to Sergei Karyakin, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.